Welcome to RPG Reanimators, a podcast for GMs where we dissect horror scenarios and offer our experiences and advice to reanimate them at the table. I'm Lex.
I'm Alex.
I'm Nathan.
Oh, and I'm Leslie.
And today we're joined by Leslie, or as you may know her, XPLovecat, a book coach, developmental editor, and YouTuber. On the XPLovecat YouTube channel, you can get some great RPG advice and reviews for scenarios and systems. And then on the Leslie XPLovecat Horn YouTube channel, you can also enjoy some book coaching advice to get your writing finished and up to shape. Thanks for joining us, Leslie.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So let's see who's in the waiting room. Today, we're consulting on formatting, editing, and writing for RPGs. Leslie is a seasoned reviewer, editor, and writer, so for a moment, we'll fuse our minds together using mad science and Zoom to share the best advice that we can for RPG scenario authors to stitch together their most well-received works of terror. So now, let's begin our consultation. So, Leslie, just to kick things off, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into RPG writing, editing, and all of this fun stuff?
Yeah, of course. So I started playing role-playing games in college, so that might be a little bit later than some people start the hobby, but I got roped into it. And I originally was in a corporate career that kind of left me a little bit creatively starved. And so I started a YouTube channel. And that kicked things off because I then did a little bit of playtesting for both board games and role-playing games. And through that experience, it kind of morphed into the editing side. And I had people finding me through my YouTube channel. So yeah, it was a very kind of slow, organic process that I discovered, oh, this is a thing that I can actually do. So I've been full-time for myself about 1.5 years now. Editing RPGs and fiction books as well.
Nice.
Awesome. So what kind of RPGs do you enjoy writing, editing?
So generally, I focus in the horror genre. My favorite role-playing game system is Call of Cthulhu. So the majority of my work has been with that system. But I also just enjoy a lot of horror role-playing games and have worked in a couple of the other systems as well. And then I also occasionally will take on an indie core like new system project, which can certainly be a fun challenge. So I've worked on a couple of those as well.
Cool.
Yeah, I've noticed that there's a considerable amount of cult and Vaesen. Actually,
Yeah.
Can you be the resident authority? Which one is it?
Yes, I can, because I had someone from Sweden who grew up in Sweden. She came into my house and played this game, and she said it's Vaesen. So it's like VAH-SIN, Vaesen.
You heard it here, folks. Definitive. All right, that's it. We can wrap up the episode. This is
Okay,
actually...
that's it. Perfect.
All right. Cut.
So let's start off with talking about formatting and writing scenarios. I think naturally we tend to throw a bunch of words on paper and then try to sift them together at once. And then formatting can come after when we try to organize those thoughts together beyond just kind of this splatter on the screen. Then we can get into more reviewing and editing stuff after that, if that sounds okay for a game plan, just trying to conceptually keep them separate.
So for our listeners, what major differences do you feel there are in approaching an RPG scenario versus having a novel?
Yeah, so the major difference between them is when you're writing a novel, it is a prescribed story you are telling to someone. So you don't have to account for any other players and brains making decisions.
Right.
And that's the big challenge with role-playing games is you have so many different ways that things at the table can be approached. So you kind of have to be creative in the different paths that players might take with a role-playing game. And I have seen many, many scenarios where it's written as if it's a story, and then you get to the table and there's a lack of
Sorry.
No naming names, Lex.
there's a lack of player agency at the table.
Yeah.
And then we get to the end of the scenario and we're like, well, that was a fun story, but like that's not really the point of playing a role-playing game.
Right.
So
Yep.
that's the major difference.
Yeah, and I would imagine that being an author for a novel, you do have 100% control over it, even if it's like a choose your own adventure game, right?
Right.
Yeah, it reminds me of a talk we recently had with Todd Kiesling, who's another horror author, doesn't really have any RPG experience, like doesn't dabble in these arcane arts at all. However, when he was talking about his writing process, it was really interesting because he would describe it like he's basically creating straw man RPG players. And like he would have his characters, he would have the situation and everything set up in like this microcosm imagined world, and then say like, well, what is this character going to do? And would basically role play out all of these characters.
Yes.
And that was how he created in his book. And it was funny because I'm just sitting there like, that's RPGs. That it's just have people, and it's really interesting kind of conceptually for me to think of that difference.
And something that I actually use with some of my novel writing clients, if they're struggling with character development, is bringing in some of that role play as well, which is kind of a really cool space for me to play in because it's melding the two sides together and taking strengths from both sides. So fun tip, if you do write fiction, that can also be a really awesome idea to play one of your characters at the table for a little bit and get immersed into their character.
That seems like a really good way to break out of like a writer's block. If you're just not sure what is going to happen next, just kind of role play it out and see what happens.
Yeah, exactly.
I imagine you could also get a friend to just role play it out as well if they're up for a challenge. Give them the parameters, the history of that character. Yeah, a lot of room.
This also brings in, sorry, this is a wild tangent, but now I'm curious. I've read several basically actual play reports where some GMs or interested players will try to novelize the events that happened in their RPG at the table.
Yes.
And, they try to turn it into a book or a story, and it just never really seems to work well, at least whenever I'm reading it. Maybe I'm picky, but curious, do you have any thoughts on why that stream doesn't necessarily go both ways?
Yes, I do. And I am currently working with a client who is doing that process. They have been working this campaign for a very long time, has lots of different characters and stories, and is writing a series based off of this. But we do have to do a lot of work to make it work as a story. And the reason why that is because although generally at the table, we have an arc of rising action and climax, all the key story points, we might have that at the role-playing games table. It doesn't always necessarily flow in a clean way where it would in a story. And the other elements that can be tricky is the combination of character development not being necessarily consistent throughout the gameplay table, or not having a core theme and point that you connect from beginning to end. Like that is messy at the table.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. I was having a conversation with a couple GMs earlier, and we were talking about like improv to planning ratio. And one of the downsides for high improv GMs is they can't really seed the start of their scenarios with hints like backstory interspersed, like you just said, Leslie. And then with high improv, you can't plan out a good mystery.
Exactly, right. And like what we were running into with this current book is there was combat encounter, but like that is maybe realistic at the table, but doesn't read well in a book. So then we had to work it and like move it around a little bit in the book and have lead up to those encounters versus just like bam, bam, cave, go.
Oh, they're fighting more wolves. This is really weird.
Inventory management, my favorite chapter. Shopping.
Yeah, I could see too, RPGs, there's so many different sessions with time in between them too, that I could see that being a big problem for voice. Not that I've ever ended a scenario with a character doing one thing and then almost switching personality the next time because I forget. That doesn't happen.
No, never.
But to bring all of this back to actual RPG scenario writing and things, at least I've learned something today. something that I've noticed from Chaosium's official Call of Cthulhu scenarios is that they tend to be pretty shake and bake in terms of their fixed structure and formatting of information to try and help keepers follow along in the same pattern across different scenarios and campaigns. It tends to go with an introduction with a quick what's going on for keepers, then dramatis personae, then more or less chapters. This more varies per item, as sometimes it can have locations or other things in there. And then you get into stat blocks and then maybe handouts at the end of it, which generally provides most of the information for keepers to run off the shelf. However, there are some scenarios for other systems like Delta Green that can sometimes be infamously bad at peppering relevant information related to different characters, topics, what have you, all throughout the text, and require GMs to either conduct hasty control Fs to try and find it at the table, or just make something up on the fly and hope that it's consistent, like naming a certain baby Joanna because reasons.
It's in the text one time. Come on.
So in your experience, are there any best practice methods that you found to keep some of this topical information collected in a helpful manner that's really useful for GMs to reference later? Because it's really different to write for yourself versus other people.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm a big lover of bullet points. I think that they're just a great way visually to bring your attention to something and break up the paragraph. So if there is something that is important, to use those bullet points, but use them sparingly. If you use them everywhere, then they lose all effect. So be careful when you use them, but I think they can be a very useful tool. Other tools that you can use would be like timelines. I always appreciate having timelines and make it a little visual as well. Charts are great. Reference sheets, page number references in your book. So if you don't want to have a huge detailed paragraph about backstory and then repeat it somewhere else, you can have that reference somewhere if keepers or GMs forget as they're going through. So I think those are a couple tools, but most importantly, it's thinking about when you're in the heat of the moment playing the game and the GM forgets a detail, is it easy for them to get enough information for them to keep the game moving? So I have seen some creative ways to do that. I think it's okay to think out of the box when you're thinking about like making reference sheets. But overall, yeah, it's just about when you're at the table, how can I quickly reference these things?
I think in addition, something that just popped into my mind is I would really love reference sheets as a GM containing dates and places of key relevance. And thinking of something like Music from a Darkened Room, it actually had something kind of like this as a handout, but I remade it with different things in it. But for other scenarios, those are the things that I am so scared of improvising on the fly. If it's details like a name or a person, cool, I can swap that out. But if I accidentally say a date that's like 20 years wrong, then that feels like a blow to my perceived credibility at the table. I know that it's not that big of a deal, but it feels bad to me. So I feel like having that little reference thing of dates and maybe places or locations could be helpful just as an extra resource for GMs.
Yeah, I've certainly run into the situation where I've said something wrong, like a date, for example, and then it spirals into something at the table, and I'm like, wait, hold on, this doesn't seem right.
And then they think it's a deeper conspiracy, and I'm like, no, guys, sorry, I meant October. I'm really sorry.
Yeah, it happens.
But in terms of some of these topical details getting sprinkled throughout the text, I suspect that a lot of it tends to happen because, at least while I'm writing scenarios, the plot kind of goes narratively. And as I'm describing sort of the greater mystery that is involved, there was something before the player character showed up, and then things that are happening behind the curtain to then lead to some sort of conclusion that PCs can do whatever they want in the interim to, influence that conclusion in some way, form, or fashion. And some details are more contextually relevant in some sections. Like if there is a dead body with a hole in his abdomen and intestines unspooled across the ground, I might have some of his details there. I may not mention them later on when I'm describing like the evil cultist and like maybe not reference that character's name and other stuff like that. Yet, this also plays into the issue of some relevant information being here, not there, and not gathered. Do you have any writing tips for potential scenario authors to consider keeping in mind to try and avoid issues like this?
Yeah, so I think generally repetition in a module is not a bad thing, but you have to be mindful of how much word count you're spending on repetition. So I think if it's something that can be summarized in, let's say, one sentence, like go ahead and put it again, even if you set it up in the intro or in the dramatis personae, you can repeat yourself in that way, but just being mindful of you don't have to repeat all the details and you can always use page references. The other thing I thought of was keeper tips, particularly in Call of Cthulhu, but other systems have versions of that, GM tips. You can always give a little bit more context or say things in a different way if it's something that is really important or essential to the scenario, but you don't want to spend another whole page going over what you may have said before.
I'm sorry, you already terrified me by mentioning repetition and word count in the same sentence. Those are like my two big triggers right now.
I'm so sorry.
Oh, shotgun scenarios.
When you're editing these and giving suggestions, do you like having inline sort of breakouts? Do you do side columns? Like what's your advice towards what's your advice towards making those stand out enough that they're noticeable but without leaving a ton of blank space?
So are you asking more from a formatting perspective, like final product formatting, or
Probably, yeah.
Okay.
Which may be outside the purview.
Yeah, I was going to say that's not exactly my wheelhouse. So my best answer, which might not be a great answer, is just to look at scenarios that you enjoy the look of and study them and see and try and replicate that in your own work.
That does bear in mind another question regarding like the GM box text. And actually this has spurred another question. But
you're welcome.
Combo.
There have been some Call of Cthulhu scenarios that I've read that went way overboard with the GM advice and then this and that. And there were like 3 different kinds of insert box text. And even the GM advice, so much of it felt woefully unnecessary. It's always easy to spot whenever someone has put too much salt in the soup. But do you have any advice for what is an acceptable or at least an okay amount on average to try and use those GM box text bits for advice?
That's a great question. I don't know that I have thought about it that specifically because it feels like a gut feeling when you're reading a scenario and it's like, oh, that's too much, or oh, we should really use a little bit more. And I think it is so dependent on the complexity of the scenario as well. So if you have a linear scenario, you might not use the boxes at all, or you might use them once.
Right.
But if you have a sandbox scenario, you might be using them once every 4 pages. Like, I'm not exactly sure what that would look like, but I think it's very dependent.
I imagine it must be pretty tough because when you're trying to make this product, this scenario for keepers, it's gonna be like a blanket, right? You're trying to make it as good for as many keepers as possible, and everyone has different keeping styles, so it's very subjective.
It is subjective. And I think the other aspect to that is going back to kind of the reference sheets and charts and guides, because we can visually show things in a different way to assist keepers where that's their learning style. And then you can have the paragraph descriptions that someone might lean into a little bit more. So just varying the way that you're presenting information, I think, can be helpful.
That actually just made me think. This is jumping a little bit more into the editing side of things, but one way that might be helpful for this, jumping off of what you just said, Alex, is if you have someone read through your scenario with you, and just if they have a pen or a highlighter or something, and as they're getting to certain sections, mark like with a question mark if they're not sure about something, or if they're wondering about it. If they're going to look at that page, then this is something that you need to clarify. I mean, maybe just by referencing in quick parentheses, or if it's happening a lot, that can be a good indicator for some box text to help out.
Cool. So I do have another question here, and it's for tabletop RPG editing advice. Now, what did you wish you knew when you were starting out in this profession?
I think what I wish I knew was that every person approaches the process differently. And so
Checks out.
Yeah, thank you. So in my head, I'm a planner. I'm very much a planner. I like to have a plan and go through things in a more organized fashion, and not everyone's brains work like that. And so I have had to learn how to work with different styles of putting together a scenario, which has been a lot of fun because you get inspiration from different people's processes. And I've really enjoyed that aspect. But yeah, I think everyone certainly approaches the work differently.
Do you have any notable examples from some of these different styles or things that have really made you go, huh, and like took note of?
I can't believe that works for them.
Wow,
Well-
what a hot mess.
I think it's some people like to have all the details worked out before they approach writing the scenario, and some people just throw stuff at it and will write random bits and pieces until they make something coherent.
Spaghetti at a wall.
Yeah, so it's more of like, when are people coming to me in the process, and I get to see different stages of the development process. And so yeah, I have experienced someone who is more chaotic, I would say. I don't think they would be mad at me for using that word. Chaotic in their process. But it does work. Like we get to the end and it does work.
How does that kind of change your approach to working on the editing? Do you find yourself working more as a guide in those cases?
Yeah, it's much more of a collaborative process. So there's a lot more back and forth in those situations when we're trying to brainstorm and like get it into a coherent form, versus some people come to me a little bit later in the process and they pretty much have like a solid draft, and then we're just working more on the development and the clarity for the GMs, making sure everything is fun, mechanics, all that good stuff.
Yeah, that's interesting. You'd mentioned that you've done board game work. Do you find that overlaps well with kind of looking at maybe new mechanics or sort of things? What do you think you brought in from that?
Yeah, so I think there's a little bit of the mechanics in terms of balancing play. So I'm going to use specifically, like for Call of Cthulhu, the sanity loss is something that I pay careful attention to. Of, okay, they saw something horrifying, but they lost 1d20 sanity. Like, well, let's maybe dial it back a little bit. And so that is more of what I see when I'm working on the mechanics side. If it's a new system, I bust out my spreadsheet and do some like statistics, which can be a little bit
I love
fun.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, like on average, it's going to do this much damage,
Yes.
right? You're going to wipe out a PC before they even have a chance, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yep, I do the same.
So the analytical side of my brain gets to light up a little bit when I'm working on that kind of work.
Do you have any sort of barometer metric advice for, and specifically I'm thinking of like Call of Cthulhu scenarios that may introduce new or novel mechanics specific to that scenario? Something like the taint in Bud's RPG review scenario Viral. Just because it's too funny to say. But do you have any sort of advice for what can make an interesting mechanic that is relevant for a scenario versus if it's not necessary and may just add tedium?
Yes. Okay. So I have two examples, and hopefully this gives a little context. So when I was working on editing The Well of All Fear by Kat Clay, she has in that scenario a card game and mechanics specifically related to that card game. Now, the game is not essential to the plot, but because it's written in the Regency era, it is a vehicle that the characters can use to get plot, to build connections. So I think that you can have these certain mechanics that, as long as they have a relevancy in being able to move characters forward, move the players forward, that it can be a really nice thing to bring to the table. On the other side, you can have a situation where it's just bogging down the gameplay, and the best way you can find that out is through playtesting. So a really simple example of this is I was working on a campaign that had a lot of nested roles. So it was like roll power and then roll intelligence. And if you fail this, if you pass this, then roll that or roll that. And then it was like, wait, I'm at the table. I don't want to like keep doing that to my players.
Yeah.
So that's an example of, okay, this is no longer fun and it's just tedious. And I think that can be worked out in a quick playtest.
Shout out to combined roles in Call of Cthulhu. I think those need to be used more.
Yeah.
So most of my experience has come more from academic writing rather than scenario writing, and I'm trying to version into that. And one of the hardest parts of academic writing, for me at least, is trying to pare down my abstract or manuscript to fit journal word limits, because it really feels like everything is important. If I remove this, it's missing crucial detail. It really needs to be there. And I can only imagine that that's really similar for scenarios. I struggled greatly trying to submit something to the Delta Green Shotgun scenario competition because 1,500 words is practically nothing. So just curious for your input on what are some good approaches for potential writers to keep in mind? Is it really helpful for them to have external editors? What advice would you give folks?
Yeah, so a second set of eyes, I think, is generally going to improve your work. You do have to be selective on who you have look at your work. Generally, I'd recommend, if you're asking someone to look at the work, make sure they've run the system at least a couple of times so that they have that base knowledge. But the way that you give someone your work, they're going to see it differently than you do, and you get nose blind to your own work. You're like, I know it all in my head, and so sometimes that doesn't always translate in an understandable way on the paper. So yes, I would recommend having someone else look at it. In terms of your question related to word count and descriptions and kind of what that looks like on the table, if you find yourself someone who might be an overwriter or over explaining things, you can always ask yourself the question of, what is the bare minimum that I need to understand this information? So like pare it back into what is the bare minimum, and you can always add back. You don't have to cut it forever. But that can be just a nice checkpoint if you're looking at your own work.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could give us like a high level walkthrough of the editing process in bullet points, of course.
Yeah, of course.
Verbal bullet points.
So that is a wonderful question, and I'll do my best to kind of do this quickly, but there are multiple types of editors, and likely if you are self-publishing, you might not need them all. So in order of when you would approach different editors, the first is a developmental editor, which is me. And I work with people who are developing their scenarios and getting the content really nailed down. So this is not grammar. This is not formatting. This is making sure that the scenario is fun, understandable, clear, and all the information is in a nice order so that when people are trying to learn your scenario, it's easy for them. Then would come the line editor, which is someone who's working on the style and the actual sentence structure to make sure that it sounds nice and that it's clear. Then comes the copy editor, which is grammar and punctuation. So really focusing on the rules of English language or whatever language you're writing in. And then the proofreader is the last step, and that's generally after formatting is complete and you would give them a PDF version and they're looking for any last minute typos or weird things that are showing up on your product that will be published. So really, it depends on your goals on what editor you'll likely be seeking out. Generally, if you're publishing, self-publishing on DriveThruRPG, you might look for a developmental editor and a copy editor potentially, but if you have strengths in grammar and punctuation, you can get away with having some typos in your scenario. Like egregious typos, not great, but a few here and there, like we're okay, we're cool. It might not be worth your budget to go and hire a copy editor.
I also think there's such a huge difference between if I'm noticing grammatical typos in a drive-through RPG thing, it's kind of like, yeah, it's fine. If I paid $55 for a hardbound book, that's the big difference that actually bothers me. I wouldn't sweat it much otherwise.
Yeah, exactly. So I think developmental editors are great for someone who's maybe struggling to develop an idea, unsure if the information is in the right place, if they have enough information on the page for them to follow, or if you're struggling with maybe using some of the mechanics, that can be a good place a dev editor could come in. Generally, a line editor can get morphed into a couple of different roles. So what I mean by that is sometimes dev editors will also line edit. Sometimes copy editors will also line edit. So my moral of the story is just make sure you're communicating with your editors and get very clear on the service that they're offering.
Thank you. That was really good.
Awesome.
I feel very educated now.
Oh, good. I'm so glad.
So as a kind of a dev editor, how do you get through this stuff quickly? Because you have to kind of get the whole scenario and you understand it and then start breaking it down, which is way different than I need to have a comma here.
Yeah. Oh, totally. So what I do, when I receive a manuscript, I read it all the way through and make very rough comments for myself of, I'm confused here. I don't know who this is. Very not what I would turn over to the client, but notes for myself. And I read through everything first. And then I will go back and start looking at those places to address where we need to include additional information. And then generally by the end, I'm also taking high level notes of like, this section isn't needed, or we can absorb this in a different way. And that is a very unscientific process. And so I will go through that multiple times, and there's probably communication happening with the writer in between those different passes, to be like, well, I think you might consider removing this section, but what do you think? Why did you put it there? So I can understand, because there's usually a reason why they did it that way. So it's also important to pick an editor that you have a nice working relationship with so that you can have those hard conversations.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. So as writers, how do we keep our editors from going insane the first time they read through that?
Yeah, I honestly haven't encountered something that made me insane before, which is a little sad. As a Call of Cthulhu player, I kind of want to go insane, but
well, maybe you're already insane. Like,
maybe.
I'm immune. I'm at 0 SAN.
But the two things I would just give as general advice when you're going to approach an editor is be prepared to turn your manuscript into them as either a Word document or a Google Doc document, and have some conversation about how much collaboration you want. So there are some people that just want to turn over their work, take a break, you look at it, I don't want to think about it for a month, and then come back. And then some people do prefer Google Docs, which is more, it's easier to collaborate and go back and forth with comments on that. So just be aware of the style you might be looking for. And then also realize that a lot of people who are editing, we book out our schedules. So if you come to me today, I'm not going to start working on it tomorrow. There will be a lead time, and I book my work out so that I don't have too much and I don't go crazy.
Yeah. In my personal experience, right, I've tried to train myself to not make my manuscript perfect before sending it to the editor. Just send it to the editor. That's the editor's job.
Yeah, exactly. That's what we're here for.
Yeah. That was something, at least, that I learned in grad school, is you learn to develop a threshold for this is good enough and send that out, because otherwise you can stay there and polish and polish and polish all day.
It's never going to get done.
Exactly. So you just got to like move on to something else. It's fine. In this same kind of threshold of if something is good enough, I tend to struggle a lot with, well, I already mentioned word count. I get most of my horror inspiration through novels. So I like to give very detailed or evocative language to try and get GM's minds turning on things. But I do know that that often inflates the word count a good bit. You mentioned paring scenarios down to just the bare bones with no adjectives or adverbs and use that as sort of your baseline. Do you have any advice for where, when, and how to drip in that evocative language? When is it really needed to try and accentuate certain scenes? When is it fine to just give a bulleted list of these are things you find on the body? You don't need to know how dripping the teeth are or anything like that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think for the horror elements, when there is something very unknown to our human brains, that can be a very useful time to use descriptions that might be a little bit more detailed. So mythos creatures, for example. I do want to know that they're gooey and gross and smell. Like that is helpful for me as a GM. But like you said, something more mundane as a dead body on the side of the road, I might not need all that description, and it could be easier from a GM perspective to improv those details. So if it's something that we have a little bit more knowledge and experience with in our real lives, I think that's something where the description isn't as necessary as maybe these weird horrific things that aren't real to my knowledge. Who knows? And I would also say that we talked a little bit about the arc, but when we go and get closer to the climax of the scenario, I want more description because that's really where I want to tighten the screws and make people feel it. And so being able to have that description is helpful for me at the table.
So I think what I'm hearing from a lot of that is focus in on your tense scenes. If there are key scenes that you know players are likely going to come across and you really want to dial in, that's great to include that detail there, maybe with some very flavorful box text that you want to put in as some ideas. And then also really dialing in on your creatures. It's something, I love running the Alien RPG also because Xenomorph's like, I already have a pretty clear image of him in my head, and there's lots of room to embellish based off of that. Whenever you're dealing with unknown horrors beyond our comprehension, it's not quite that easy. And so being able to provide some more details in there could be helpful. Or something I'm wondering, I want to get your input on. Instead of just having regular old stat blocks, how would you feel about having a little bit of almost a narrative box text involving the main creatures of interest in the scenario that could give an example of, like, if you've run this scene through your mind of it terrorizing someone or like ripping something apart, to use that as a bit of an example to try and get GM's minds going instead of just saying strength 60, dex 45, con 80 and moving on with there, because I tend to just see sacks of hit points and a list of spell names I'm not going to look at and improvise what they do. Curious for your thoughts on that.
So I think where that can be used is having a brief description of the monster within their stats. So like in the beginning of their stat block, having a bit of a description.
Okay.
I would worry about that going a little bit overboard and also straying away from the core scenario. I like more of a distraction than a helpful guide. And so while I think it could work and I would want to see an example of it, my gut is telling me that it would be more of a distraction than anything else.
Gotcha. I'm thinking a bit of like the Call of Cthulhu Keeper Guide, where it has some kind of like Lovecraft excerpt from whatever story that the creature is pulled from, an image, and then getting into the main stats. So just it's some sort of flavor text. Maybe that's the word I'm looking for.
Yeah. I think that could be useful in the back of the book or wherever you're placing those stats, generally in the back of the book. That's where you can have that information. And it can also be, because GMs are used to looking for the stats there, that can be a good place to know that they're going to find that information in that section and not have to search through it throughout the scenario.
Lex, I think you're going to love this new publishing company called World of Darkness. I think they've got you covered for fiction in amongst stuff.
Oh, really?
One other thing I want to say on this topic was when you're using descriptions, the one thing you just want to be careful of, which we talked a little bit about, is not going too far in the narration. So oftentimes I will see when the players do this, then this happens and the monster does this. And it's like, no. The players might not do that. So you have to say, if the players do this, and it's a minor thing, but for GMs, it does, I think, make a difference when you're like, oh, I don't have to railroad them into the specific scene that's really detailed out and full of descriptions, and leaves a little bit of room.
Especially
Language
for GMs who tend to run things a bit like rules as written and feel like, oh, unless it's this specific trigger, that won't go, or other worse outcomes.
They could be like subconsciously compelled to do that when the text does say that.
Right.
Yeah.
Good point.
So one of the things you mentioned is finding an editor that's kind of vibes with what you're doing. How do you find an editor? Like, if I'm a new writer, who do I reach out to? Where do I look?
Yeah, so there are a lot of different avenues to attempt to find editors. The first is if you are publishing on DriveThruRPG, I would recommend looking in the credits pages on other DriveThruRPG scenarios for the system that you're writing for. There will often be editors that work on those books, and you can always find and research them and look out for that information. A lot of people find me through my YouTube channel, so that's another option if there are people that do reviews or other people who talk a lot about the game and you vibe with the way that they describe the game. They might be open to editing, even if they haven't edited before. They might be open to trying some sort of collaboration. So you can always look at that avenue. And I know specifically for Chaosium's systems, we have resources called Creators Helping Creators on Facebook pages. So really tapping into your community with the games that you're playing. And I think you'll be able to find people. It shouldn't be too hard to scrounge up an editor.
Yeah, getting people to read stuff.
Right.
This is a good community for it.
Worst case scenario, you can try summoning them. I think that there's pretty good luck there.
Yep. I've been summoned once or twice.
So then you found your editor online. You've sent them the email and they've said, sure, I'd love to take a look. What's the best way to make sure that you're getting the most out of them with the time they're spending?
Yeah, definitely. I think the first stage before you ever sign a contract, which yes, you should have a contract if you are paying someone, and that would be the editor's responsibility. That's not on the writer to provide that, but the editor should provide some sort of contract, even if it's basic, and that just protects you and your work. There should be a clause in there that's about you get to retain all of your work and rights, and we don't own any of it. So that it is just a peace of mind thing as well. Sorry for that tangent. Contracts are important.
This is great. Yeah.
But before you sign something, I do recommend that you get on a phone call with the editor to get a little bit of more information about how you could work together. I think it's a really nice checkpoint of, do we work together? Are we thinking and approaching things in a similar way? Are you comfortable on the phone with them? Like, if you're not feeling comfortable, that's probably telling you, oh, they might not be the best fit for me. They might be a great fit for someone else, but they're not the best fit for me. And it can also be helpful to gauge like how they give feedback as well. So I tend to give encouraging feedback. I'm going to tell you if it's not working, but I'm also going to tell you good job. Like, I like doing both of those things. So that phone call is really a good thing for both the editor and the writer to see if it's working well.
So when someone comes into that phone call, do you usually just like have a subsection that you talk through? What should the writer kind of bring to the table there?
Yeah, that's a good question. So sometimes editors will read through a couple of pages. Like, they're not going to spend a ton of time dissecting your scenario before you get to working together. But just to read and be familiar with your writing style can be important before you get on the phone call. And then what I'm really looking for when I'm talking to a writer is I want to know about your goals. I want to know where you're struggling and to make sure that I can help and I can fill that void that you're looking for. So I would, if you're a writer, I would come prepared to speak to those things about what you might be struggling with and ultimately what your goals are for your scenario.
Like that, take that kind of high level look at your work.
Yeah, exactly. And then once you do decide, okay, this is a great fit, let's work together, I think finding a method that works for you. So we talked a little bit about that collaboration piece and how much you're looking for, having that communication. Once you get feedback, don't be afraid to ask clarifying questions. I love when I get clarifying questions because that's an opportunity for us to work out the kinks of whatever might be, we might not agree on something. Yeah. And also know that at the end of the day, you can choose to do whatever you want with your writing. I might give feedback that you don't like, and that's okay. But I would say to make the most out of your editing experience, you may want to look at, okay, why did they give me this feedback? Is there a different solution? I don't like that solution. Is there a different solution? Because generally, if we're pointing something out, it's because it's not working.
Great. So I think let's talk a little bit about published works that you've read that you look at and you go, wow, that was edited amazing.
So with Call of Cthulhu scenarios, there was one that I thought of that is Cat's Cradle. And this was written by Aaron Sinner, Todd Waldron, and Christopher Olson. Mm-hmm. And this is a scenario that was intended to be a sequel to The Haunting. And the use of their bullet points, their context that they use, they have a really great timeline in that scenario, and keeper notes. So they use all of those elements that I have talked about previously in a way that feels helpful and not overdone. Mm-hmm. Generally, the scenario is not over formatted either. So it's a really great example of something that can be very successful. And it's basically just white page with some red text thrown in some places.
Wow. Okay.
In addition to that, it is a sandbox scenario, and it's one of the best written sandbox scenarios that I've played through DriveThruRPG. It's very streamlined well. It was very easy for me to have the different locations that people go to in any order. So I would highly recommend that you take a look at Cat's Cradle because it's just a very easy scenario for the GM to prep while also working really well at the table.
That's really high praise, and I'm going to have to check it out after this call. I've heard some things about it, but haven't really looked much into it myself. Also, sandbox scenarios tend to be ones that I may struggle with the most because it's so easy for players to just stall out. Do you have any advice, either related to this scenario or just in your broader experience, for helping lay out sandbox scenarios in very compelling ways to keep GMs and players involved and up to pace?
Yeah, so sandboxing can be really tough because you have to think of a lot of different ways and paths that the players can go. So my biggest tip is to make sure that you have duplicate clues. So that's not saying you have the same note in duplicate places, but it's either one, clues that can be easily moved, so that's an option, or it can be different clues that lead to the same thing. That generally fixes the kinks that can come with stalling out, as you mentioned, is we have ways that we can move around the clues that are already in different locations.
Nice.
If you're actually working on writing this, flowcharts can be really helpful just to kind of organize. They might go this way or they might go this way. Here are the different paths and making sure that they have the information that they need to continue. And ideally, that flowchart is going to get narrower and narrower until you get to the end part of your scenario.
Alex knows all about clue flowcharts. He's our most organized.
I've got like a monstrosity for hellhole. The scenarios I have.
Yeah, I think you use a mind map for that too. That can be a useful tool to kind of visualize these different clues. And if you look at it and the lair of the supervillain has one clue pointing to it, that might be something to revisit and
Mhm.
figure out how you can redirect some of those.
Yeah.
I found that flowchart software really helps.
Yes, definitely. And if you're looking for a good model for flowchart clues, if you don't want spoilers, this might not be good. But if you've played this or don't mind spoilers, the Masks of Nyarlathotep campaign has clue maps for each
Oh.
chapter. And so it's a cool example to kind of see, okay, how is everything connected?
And here I am just with pen and paper. I tried using flowchart softwares, and I haven't found one that works. Do either of y'all have any recommendations in general?
Yeah, I recommend the software Milanote. It's like a website browser-based flowchart software, so you can access it anywhere with your account. It's you can have it on your phone as well. So whenever I have an idea, I just type it in, plop it.
The other option that is less specific to flowcharting, but Canva, I'm very familiar with using, and I know a lot of people use it. It's fun, and then you can be a little bit creative with your colors, and if you need a little inspiration, make something purple, and then you're good to go.
Yeah, Canva's really got a lot under it too of different applications you can use it for.
Yeah, definitely.
Not just making new Discord emojis? I'm shocked. I don't really believe
that's the number one use,
Yeah.
but you know.
Making t-shirts? What about that? I think too, we were talking a little bit up front about Vaesen.
Vaesen.
Yes, that's pretty sure that's what I said.
As you were saying.
Vaesen. Yeah, so with the Vaesen core book, what kind of drew you to that? Why is that well done, do you think?
Yeah, so this is one that I think is very well edited, if we're talking about kind of the editing flow in the core system space, which is really tough. There are a lot of really not great core rule books. And I think the way that it flows, it's very easy to reference, which is kind of the number one thing that I'm looking for is I forgot that rule. Okay, I know exactly where to go to look for this. And so, yeah, I think just the way that it's written and sectioned out is very helpful for being able to figure out where I need to go when I have a question.
Yeah, that makes sense. The only thing that I wish they'd changed is put the equipment list at the end where I can find it in a hurry. I know a lot of like the Morkborgs of the world. That's a pretty popular thing anymore. Is the front cover and the back cover are cheat sheets.
Yes.
So you'll open it there and find that. I'm a big fan of that.
Yeah, that's really helpful.
Yes, make information easy to find.
On that note, one quick question. In your personal preference, out of all the scenarios that you've reviewed, written, edited, so on and so forth, do you prefer having your handouts, maps, and other things all at the end of the scenario or interspersed throughout? We recently covered the code, and I don't know if you're familiar with that one, but like it just has this massive handout that's in the wrong place. It's in the middle of locations, and then the map is also
a 4-page handout.
So yeah, what's your input on that?
Yeah. Okay, so my personal preference is that I at least get to see a picture of what it is within the scenario.
With no spoilers.
So if there is, let's say there's something that's a larger handout that you don't want to take up a full page for, that's fine. Make it smaller so I know that what I'm looking for when I do flip to the back of the book. I find it a lot easier to just orient myself when I see right next to each other. Okay, this is what's happening, and here's the handout associated with it. If it's nice if I can read and understand it without having to flip to the back of the book, but if I have to, that's not a big deal. I can do that, but it just helps also reinforce what handouts I need to give when I actually see the picture in that section.
Nice.
Do you play mostly in person or online? Do you think there's a big difference towards how you can use handouts in those?
I play mostly in person. I have played online a few times. So I think that with online play, it can be a little bit easier to kind of be able to disperse handouts at appropriate times, because you can just be like, click, okay, you have this now, which that's pretty cool. But otherwise, I don't think there's a ton of difference between the two formats.
I'll put a plug out here for those that are making their PDFs. Please put all your handouts in separate files that I can just send to people. That would be awesome. Thank you very much.
And hyperlinks are lovely. Working hyperlinks are much more appreciated.
All right, well, we're coming up on time here. So is there anything we missed that you wish we talked about, or things listeners should know?
Yes, I think that the last thing I'll leave, which is not really specific to editing, but more generally when you're writing, I think there's a lot of room for creativity in this space. So don't be afraid to try something a little bit new or different, whether that's creating a monster that is completely new out of your brain, or maybe it's adding a music playlist to your scenario. I love when there's music inserted. And so generally, like, I know that it can be a great starting place to look at Chaosium scenarios or whatever system that you're writing for and kind of use that as a base. But on Drive-Thru RPG, there's so much potential for you to be creative and follow the whim of whatever makes you excited, which is really, at the end of the day, the most important thing is that you're having fun.
Love that.
We hope these deranged ravings have been helpful for you to stitch your splattered words together into new and terrifying scenarios. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to things that we discussed in this episode, as well as an invite to our lab's Discord server to help discuss some more reanimations and consultations. We also post these episodes and resources to our Patreon that's free to follow, or if you like, you can make a charitable donation to help us keep the ominously flickering lights on at the H. West Memorial Mortuary and Laboratories. Leslie, where can people find you to bang on your door and ask for more editing?
Yes, of course. So the best place to follow me and keep up with all the cool stuff and games that I am playing is my YouTube channel, XPLovecat. And if you're working on a Call of Cthulhu scenario or horror scenario right now that you could use a second pair of eyes on, you can contact me through my website. I'd love to hear about your project and see if I can help you out so that you can feel more confident about publishing it.
We'll also try and post any details for the summoning ritual to try and get an easier time contacting Leslie if we can find it.
And we have to dig through manuscripts.
So until next time, thanks for listening to RPG Reanimators,
where your games can die.
Or live.
On the table.
Lex, any follow-up things we need to do? Do we need to make a Vaesen, let's call the whole thing off joke?
Vaesen.
Well, I've been waiting for something terrible to put at the end of the after credits thing, so I think you just gave me that.
Yay!
We should be good.
I don't think I said it right in any of those.
Free League is going to come after you.